as you're aware, and the Prime Minister referred to a few times, they're planning in the spring of 2025 to launch a 10-year plan. Now, the history of 5-year and 10-year plans in NHS reform in recent times is not kind of a glorious history. But I think that the Darzi review is probably best understood as being actually implicitly political, but it's very political. So if you look at the four main things that the Darzi review itemizes as being kind of the principal causes, there's the pandemic. Then there was the Lansley reforms, which became the 2012 Health and Care Act.
This is Andrew Lansley, the former Tory
That's
Health
right,
Secretary.
I'm sorry. Andrew Lansley, Lord Lansley now, who introduced a set of NHS reforms under the coalition government, which were highly controversial, actually were stopped in their tracks. In their
The pause.
The famous pause. And Lord Lansley tried to essentially rework the NHS operating system and turn it into something where choice by patients, competition, real, proper, full competition, and clinical commissioning. So decisions about resource and service provision driven by the primary care clinicians. So those three C's, choice, competition, clinical commissioning, were meant to become the new NHS operating system. One of the interesting things I think to reflect on is that there was this enormous political row to get the Lansley reforms passed as the 2012 Health and Social Care Act. And then it essentially didn't happen. So what did happen was that a bunch of local bureaucratic organisations changed their names. And in fact, we had a reduction in bureaucracy. So that was one of the big Lansley themes, was to cut bureaucracy and in fact cut management. They cut management by 45% of the 2008-9 level, so the last year of the pre-financial crisis funding. This was interesting because ultimately it had 150 local bureaucratic organisations which were responsible for commissioning under the sort of the new Labour administration, and he reduced bureaucracy by going from 150 to 219. So that was a really interesting way to reduce bureaucracy. He also reduced bureaucracy by creating the NHS Commissioning Board, which is now called NHS England, which was the biggest quango in the world. And the idea was that this was going to become the organising power, and power was going to shift from the politician, from Andrew Lansley as the Health Secretary, and power would be taken by NHS Commissioning Board, latterly NHS England. And the intention behind that, I think, was a noble one, which was to remove overt politicisation from decision-making about, for example, where you have to shut an A&E because you can't staff it adequately, which is a huge issue for the current chair of the Commons, Lindsay Hoyle. He's very, very unhappy that his local A&E has been downgraded, and he keeps referring to it at health question time. But at the end of the day, the Lansley reforms cost an immense amount of political capital to the Conservatives. You might remember, under David Cameron, were ahead on health.
Yeah.
They were ahead of Labour on health, and that's really unprecedented. And so essentially they burned through all of this political capital, passed the legislation, and then in reality the legislation really achieved no traction.
Right.
And one of the reasons for this is that every time you re-disorganise the NHS in a big way, you effectively get everybody to apply for their jobs back.
Yeah.
That's actually rarely helpful, I think, in any organisational system.
Yeah.
And, so instead of people thinking, okay, we now have a much lower level of growth than we had been thinking we would have because there's been a global financial crisis. And so, the NHS got minor protection, whereas most other departments, and in particular local government, huge cuts. Now, of course, local government being responsible for social care, that had profound impact on the NHS over the 2010s decade.
Yeah.
Because, of course, one of the issues that's highlighted in Lord Darzi's review is the number of people who are in hospital medically well, but needing some level of social care support either in their home or in a community setting,
Yeah.
which they aren't able to get, either because the provision simply isn't there, because providers have exited the market because they couldn't make the level of margin that they wanted to make, or because the person can't afford it and their family can't afford it, because social care is means tested. So fundamentally, if you have assets to a total value of more than £19,500,
Yeah.
social care is not free. You will pay for it
Until you run down those assets.
until you've run your assets down.
And Rachel Reeves has already announced, as I understand it, that the cap
Yes, the
that was
deal
going to
not.
be at 86,000
Yes,
on what you spend in a lifetime on social care
Yeah.
is not now going to go ahead. So
That's right.
That's now
yes.
on the table again.
Yeah, we really are at back to square
Square one.
zero.
Yeah.
I think, and this is important. And apologies if I bore you
No, the
guys and your,
details
and
are
your
really
listeners
important.
slightly
Yeah.
slightly with the history. So, looking at the provision of long-term care was something that was last done by the Royal Commission, and this was under the New Labour government. So that was set up in 1997. Now, when the NHS plan, which was the first major document, and that was a 10-year vision strategy, which was very influenced by a guy called Simon Stevens, who will crop up again, I think, probably in our conversation, because Simon was the health policy advisor first to Alan Milburn, who was the health secretary for New Labour under their reforming period, and then he became the health advisor to Tony Blair, to the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
He then left the UK and went and worked in the United States. He was, kind of an executive director for United Health, which is one of their huge players in the US health system. And ultimately, when the NHS Commissioning Board was created and the initial chief executive, Sir David Nicholson, stood down, David Cameron and George Osborne went to great lengths to persuade Simon Stevens to come back from the United States, because they recognised that the Lansley reforms had effectively created chaos and left everything in a very challenging situation. And they figured, well, the guy who wrote the last plan for the NHS might be the guy who can pull our fat out of the fire on this one. So apologies for that little digression around the politics and the history. But I think it's slightly necessary to understand why Lord Darcy has picked on the Lansley reforms in particular as being kind of emblematic of the way the NHS has declined in performance since 2010, because your listeners can go to any of the major resources like the King's Fund or the Nuffield Trust or the Health Foundation, the three main sort of health think tank bodies, and you'll find the same story, which is fundamentally in 2010 the NHS was probably performing as well as it's ever performed since we've comprehensively measured what it does and assessed what it does. You will remember that at the beginning of that decade, people were facing 18-month waits for cardiac surgery, joint replacement, cataract operations. And by the end of that period, the NHS was really consistently hitting 18 weeks as a sort of an emblematic, achievement. One of the interesting things, I think, about the politics and policy of the NHS is that all of those targets, so achieving elective care within 18 weeks, 61 days from the diagnosis of cancer to the start of treatment, 4-hour waits in A&Es, these were never abolished.
Yeah.
They were just missed.
Right.
Comprehensively, really.
And did people stop talking about them? I mean, did they just become foregone conclusions?
So that took a fair while. Yeah. So the best performing organisations in the NHS were still just about hitting the 4-hour A&E target up until 2014-15.
Yeah.
But most were not. I don't think that the cancer targets, which were 2-week diagnosis and 61 days from diagnosis to start treatment, I don't think that's been hit since 2013 or 14.
Because one of the things, Andy, that became clear in Keir Starmer's reaction to the Darcy report was that a lot of emphasis has been put on COVID and the pandemic for the reason that the NHS is in such disarray. Actually, Darcy was saying, no.
The roots are...
It well precedes COVID.
Yes. So if we were to just take the the backlog of people needing elective care, something that probably has to be done in a hospital. So currently that's 7.8 million. It's not 7.8 million individuals, but it's 7.8 million procedures. So they think it's probably about 6 million individuals.
Huge number still.
Huge proportion of the population.
Yeah.
It's practically 1 in 10 is waiting for NHS care. And there's something which maybe we'll talk on a bit in a minute about kind of how that's become normalised.
Yeah.
That in a way, it almost felt as if our politics had got to the point where we just went, the NHS is terrible. And it is simply thus.
Yes.
That it wasn't kind of like a series of decisions and omissions which led to it being in this state.
So just to cut in a bit, but the paradox being also that the NHS is on this pedestal in people's heads.
Yeah.
We know it doesn't work, but we also think it's
Yeah.
the greatest health system in the world, and those two things can't be true.
No, I mean, the cognitive dissonance there is really impressive. If there's a thing that I profoundly detest and wish we could move beyond, it's sort of NHS simpering. If Rachel Reeves has got these huge holes in her budget and she needs to raise money, bang, very simple, we put a super tax on NHS simpering. So anybody who uses the phrase "our NHS,"
That's the
instant fine,
magic money tree, isn't it?
£5,000.
You go to the back of the waiting list.
Exactly. Anybody who says greatest health system in the world, remedial levels of fines have to be. We're confusing two different things, I think, in a big way when we have that conversation. One of which is we still have some people alive today, although very few, who can remember when the NHS wasn't there.
Yeah.
And that's very much, I think, become a part of the British folk memory. And like, in a sense, the origin story that we tell ourselves about the welfare state, and in particular, the reforms brilliantly chronicled by Nick Timmins' fabulous book, The Five Giants.
Yeah.
An absolute classic, which I know many of your listeners will know. But fundamentally, there is something we really love about that, and it is a part of the story that British English people, we tell ourselves about ourselves. I mean, the fact is it cropped up in the Olympics opening ceremony in 2012.
And baffled the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Remarkable stuff. But yeah, I mean, I'm deeply against wearing badges saying I heart the NHS.
Okay.
I mean, because I kind of think, well, where's your other badge saying, I get wood for the motorway network, or
You missed a career in marketing.
I simp for HMRC. Both of which are at least as important to your general well-being as the NHS is. So yeah, NHS worship is horrible.
Yeah.
And no one should do it, and it should be heavily fined.
Yeah.
But if you look at the opinion polling, and we have really, really good long-term data, particularly from the British Social Attitude Survey, amusingly, when Lord Lansley was dragging his reforms through the parliamentary process, he disinvested from the health questions in the British Social Attitude Survey. That was previously sponsored by the Department of Health.
Right.
And in fact, the health think tanks, the King's Fund and Nuffield Trust and Health Foundation, got together and made sure that funding was made available. So you continued that data series over a long period of time. And essentially, what you have seen on almost linear progression since 2010 is serious deterioration in public perceptions of the NHS. Now, there's a different set of questions which are periodically asked about public support for the NHS and willingness to countenance paying a little bit more tax.
Yes.
Very sparky guy called Dan Needle, tax expert, who's really great work on taxation system. And he did a survey not so long since about what people would actually be willing to pay to improve the NHS, and it turned out that for most people it's about a tenner a year.
Right.
So that's probably not going to cut it, is
not
it?
Not really as
such.
We'll
talk your figures. I mean, one that leapt out of the report, the Darzi report, to me anyway, was, and I hadn't really appreciated this, was the 37 billion shortfall in capital expenditure. And one of the themes of the report, which sort of is a kind of hanging question in the air for Starmer and Wes Street in the health secretary, is, Darcy's saying it's fine to appoint lots of people and get lots of personnel in, but unless they have the right equipment and the right plant and the right facilities and wards that are, decent, you're not going to get decent healthcare, and you're also not going to get productivity. And I wonder, do you think that from what you heard from Starmer today, and we've heard from Wes Street since the election, indicates that they will be able to make up that shortfall?
I think a lot of people are going to have to wear their "I heart the NHS" badge and get full. No, it's because
it's a lot of money, isn't it?
It's a huge sum of money. I mean, this was always one of the things of what I used to call the new fictional hospitals program.
Yeah.
Weren't 40 of them. They weren't going to be new hospitals, and there wasn't any
Boris
money
Johnson's
for them.
big.
Yeah,
thing.
it was a beautiful. It was a real piece of Dominic Cummings campaigning, wasn't it? Put a big number there, and then people can argue about the big number, but all the time they're arguing about the big number, they're having heard the big number.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is what makes potentially, I think, for great campaigning, but appalling governing. Because at some point, if you've started to have this conversation about 40 new hospitals, and you're in power for any period of time, at some point they have to start being built.
Yeah.
And being staffed and being opened. And of course, this hasn't happened. So they've claimed credit for a few schemes which were, in two cases, delayed by the collapse of Carillion, the outsourcer and kind of multinational, which was doing the Midland Metropolitan and Liverpool Women's hospital redevelopments, and they were stopped because Carillion went bankrupt.
Yeah.
And then that had to be restarted, using central government money, and these were then presented as part of the new hospitals program, which was sort of, I mean, there are certain things in health policy, it's not generally the sparkiest, most hilarious of environments, so I guess we have to take our grim humour where we can get it. Capital is amazingly important, and so there's sort of two different things, one of which is the backlog to set everything right that's within the system as it is today. And that's, you get the data from a thing called the Estates Return Information Collection, ERIC. And ERIC comes out every December, and everybody gets very depressed because it's so many billions. And it's kind of currently, next number obviously due in a few months' time. Last number was kind of just under 13 billion pounds.
And this is to fix
everything that's broken within the existing NHS estate.
Rather than to
in
bring
England.
it up to date. This is just a repair job.
Yes.
This is mending the
This is business as usual.
Yes. This is making sure that all of the leaking roofs would be fixed, all of the broken doors would be repaired, and etc. But so it's nothing more than.
And that's a 13 billion pound bill.
That's
at the
13.
Minute. Yeah. Okay.
So if we say that Darcy's talks about 38, and he effectively says, and I think there's quite a neat graph in his report, actually had that money been spent since 2010, we wouldn't be needing 40 new hospitals in the way in which we are. But one of the things that happened, because the NHS did get inflation plus a tiny bit, where most of the rest of the public sector did not, and local government, as I say, budget slashed by virtually half. I mean, one of the things which I was quite ignorant about until I started to wrap my head around the Lansley reforms was the fact that what we all pay in council tax wasn't the majority of the income that local government used to have. It was mostly central government grant. So, central government's been absolutely hammered. And of course, one of the things, little subplot of the Lansley reforms, was it shifted public health from being the responsibility of the Department for Health, and it shifted it into local government. Now, we saw some potentially really good results of that during the pandemic, where local directors of public health did some seriously impressive work in sort of tracking COVID in their populations, health need in their populations, and there was some good things, and I think there are some very strong arguments for having public health cited with local government insofar as kind of the determinants of health, what makes us healthy, good housing, access to transport, a local economy that provides jobs, etc., are kind of with a adequately funded, planned and free local government in that fantasy world. Public health could sit there terribly well. But of course, another theme of the Darcy report is kind of the health of the population, and it has been tending to get worse. Now, austerity will clearly play some part in that, but people's individual taking control of their health plays another part in that. Access to places where you can exercise is another part of that. But one of the things which, as I say, the NHS was getting kind of 1%. I think Darcy says over the 2010 to 2019 period, growth averaged kind of 1%, adjusted for inflation. But historically, healthcare is expensive, and we spend more on it because our population ages. There are more things we can do, and we have until, in fact, the 2010s decade, we have been seeing life expectancy improve as a result of all this.
One of the things, Andy, that Starmer touched on was the idea of, rather than reactive treatments, being able to monitor health and keep people healthy rather than treating sick people all the time. Now, for instance, I've been wearing for the last couple of weeks this Whoop thing, which is like a wearable health monitor for, and it monitors me 24 hours a day, tells me what my heart rate is, my blood oxygen levels, all of this stuff. And it doesn't seem a great leap to say that at some point that information could go into the Matt Kelly NHS file and I would be diagnosed before I got ill. If when the trends are tracking badly, it would see, and you could prevent a lot of this horrible, expensive illness before it happened. Is that part of the future?
I'm pretty certain it is. I mean, every single person who's got a smartphone has got some kind of basic health functionality on it now, I think, where you can learn how many steps you did, etc., and the likelihood is that this will all become absolutely standard. And there are people that people have personalized health apps where they can store all of this data and share it with.
And presumably AI helps monitor and diagnose. And
yes, so where AI is one of these fascinating things where I'm starting to hear it in the health debate, and I'm starting to think cryptocurrency because the level of overclaiming versus the actual practical uses at the moment. AI is going to do some things fantastically well. So transacting with vast data sets and trying to pick out signal as opposed to noise. AI is already pretty good at that.
Well, Google search history has been shown to be a very good diagnostic tool alone, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I mean,
is that right? So just explain that. So
there have been, Google have done some, this is a while back, but they did some tests where they actually it was prostate cancer, I believe it was, and they tested a group of men's Google searches, and they were better than identifying their propensity to prostate cancer than their regular visits to GPs.
So based on the questions these men are asking,
well, first
Google,
of all, you start, like back pain.
Right. Fascinating.
And anyway, so that was one. But just going absolutely basic level, Andy, I mean, one of the three big things that Starmer and Streeting identified was analog to digital, which, had a kind of nostalgic feel to it. It took me back to the late 90s. It was rather sweet. I felt like it was Britpop all over again. But I mean, seriously, one of the things that I've been amazed by is how little the various digital systems within the NHS talk to one another.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I mean, it's unbelievable. And now, is that just inefficiency, or does it have to do with data protection? What's the problem? Or both?
Data protection is often invoked, and I think often falsely invoked. I suspect that the real problem is that there are times when you want the NHS to operate very locally and be the neighbourhood health service.
Yes.
And actually one of the shifts that Darcy is clearly signposting very hard is that, and that's been a theme of Wes Streeting's talks, the neighbourhood health service,
Hospitals, community, and all that. Yeah,
all of it. But one of the challenging issues is that once in a while we want the NHS to be a really national system. So during health emergencies like the pandemic would be a classic example. But I would say another of those times is when we do something like buying IT. Because we should be turning around to suppliers and saying, you are going to make your systems interoperable, you are going to make them open, and if you do not do these things, we are not going to be buying from you.
Yes.
And the NHS is a huge customer. And there has been, I don't know all the reasons why, but there has been a total failure for the NHS to insist that all software suppliers to the NHS provide full interoperability and, make their products able to work with other products. And it should just be as simple as you've got 18 months to deliver this. If you do not deliver this by the end of 18 months, you are not going to be supplying the NHS anymore.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, just so anecdote is always the enemy of good argument in these things, but just to break that rule momentarily, I was talking to someone yesterday who'd been through a routine procedure, signing off with a specialist, and was looking for some aftercare with the GP. Yeah. And the specialist was saying, well, I will send an email, but you'll have to go through all the rigmarole with the GP again. And this person said, but can't you just send over everything that I could see on your screen? He said, oh, no, the IT's different. And I thought, it's sort of, it must be so, well, it was visibly stressful.
Yeah.
And also a waste of the specialist's time and the GP's time.
The idea that the NHS can operate no more efficiently is patent nonsense.
Yeah.
It is absolutely absurd, and everybody who uses NHS services and everybody who provides NHS services can probably think of some examples where, it's not going to take 10 years to improve that.
No.
It's going to take 10 years to work through, the level of backlog that we have at the present time. Look at how you can change the funding mix between hospitals, and Darcy is very clear about how well the hospital sector has done and how relatively poorly community, primary care, mental
district
health,
nurses, all that.
District nurses have done. But I mean, the simple reality is we have sort of talked about doing this for a very long time, and in a sense, the sort of the health think tank world and sort of geeks like me who are interested in health policy, we're almost kind of like opposition, like being in political opposition, because we can say things. We can say, you need to do this. This needs to be different.
But that's
good. It's great to work out what the problems are. But what Labour is now facing is they have become a successful opposition because they've got into government, and effectively one of the key skills of opposition is the saying skills, and it is the rhetoric skills.
Yes.
Now we get to the crunchy bit where the rubber is going to start to hit the road, and you are going to have to do things. And by doing some of these things, you are going to create winners and losers.
So what should they be doing? Let's get to the bone of this. What should because I like I said at the beginning, I listened to Keir Starmer's speech, and I was really none the wiser at the end of it as to actually what was going to happen. I heard a lot of how terrible things were and how everything had been wrecked. Got that, thank you. And then I heard about it's going to take 10 years to fix it, and it's mission-led, and we don't want to talk about history and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But there was no, here's the shopping list of 4 things that we're going to do.
There isn't.
What should they be doing?
They have got, I suspect they know this, so I'm going to go for the one that the Treasury would find least palatable first.
Yeah.
They are going to have to put in some money for the capital stuff.
And they can borrow to invest, can't they, within their fiscal rules?
I mean, absolutely. Right. Now, there has been some talk coming that there'd be a new wave of PFI to do the capital stuff. Now, firstly, PFI was horrible value for money.
Just explain PFI.
Sorry, the Private Finance Initiative, which was essentially where the government contracted with big building companies and investment banks to, quickly design and build new hospitals. And
Yeah.
this system started under the Conservatives, and I think Hinchingbrook in John Major's constituency, if I recall correctly, which later got into huge trouble and had its management franchised to a private company who failed. But that, I think, was one of the first PFI in NHS PFIs.
It was slightly like buying furniture on the Never Never, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. So the early deals were particularly horrible, and they tied the NHS in for 35 or 40-year contracts and left levels of ambiguity about who owned the thing at the end of the process. Later deals were probably a bit less bad, but still didn't consider refinancing and how, when interest rates dropped, the PFI companies were able to refinance all of their debt massively cheaply and keep all the gain.
Yeah.
So there's a vast swathe of lessons if that is to happen again, and I guess it might because of the financial circumstances. But the main one would be, how are you going to manage the contracts? Because it was left up to local organisations to manage their own PFI contracts. Once again, to me, this is blatantly a job that should be done once nationally by some really hardcore, very expensive people.
Yes.
So, again, Treasury will hate me if they ever hear this, but you're going to have to pay some people some really big salaries, because you're going to need people who are fantastic at procurement. You're going to need people who are fantastic at managing PFI contracts.
And shark spotters.
And you're also going to need talent spotters.
Yes.
And people who can manage change in complex adaptive systems, and healthcare is a very complex adaptive system. You're not going to hire these people in from management consultancy.
Right.
We have tried management consultancy to death, and ultimately all we've done, certainly in the NHS, is created a revolving door between senior figures in NHS organisations, national organisations particularly, and the major, management consultancies.
But Andy Starmer said he's not going to throw more money at it until it's been reformed. So how do you square that off? There's a bit of a catch-22 there.
So perhaps
no money without reform.
no money without reform. So
but
you're right.
Then you get people stuck in the middle, don't you?
You
know.
I mean, so there's a real problem there. In the 2000s decades, when the economy was ticking along very nicely, and therefore it was possible to throw significant extra money at the NHS. So between 2000 and 2010, the NHS budget more than doubled. The annual revenue budget went from sort of 48 billion to 110 or so in 10 years. Now, that I think is not about to happen again.
No.
But there are some things which the cost of carrying on having a 13 billion maintenance backlog is going to be, the opportunity cost is going to be more than the financial cost of fixing it.
Yeah.
So reform can look like a lot of different things, and Wes Streeting's he's kind of got to ride two horses at the same time, which doesn't sound comfortable, and I'm sure it won't be. But one of the horses is the horse called crisis. That the NHS actually is in a crisis. We know, nailed on, that this winter its performance is going to be horrible again, as it has been for many, many winters past. And there are probably a set of national actions that you're going to be able to take by brokering some resource or some staff from area to area that may or may not make some impact on how horrible the winter crisis is going to be. We know where the ambulance crises happen. We've just seen it over repeated years. What we don't have in place is a situation that does anything about it.
Yeah.
It's funny you say that, because we first came into contact, very much to my benefit, during COVID.
Yes.
And I remember a phrase used, which was political entropy, which is that a crisis happens, there's a massive moment of agreement, political will, solidarity, everyone steps to, and then the will dissipates. How can Starmer and his colleagues, over a period of 10 years, avoid political entropy just making this another set of slogans?
One thing which I have advocated a few times, in fact Simon Stevens did it once during COVID, I think that the NHS's national leadership should regularly, with the health secretary, do one of those Downing Street style briefings, and I think they should track what's changing.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer that if you want to get behaviours to change, culture to change, and delivery to change, and delivery comes out of behaviours and culture as much as it comes out of resource and capital.
Correct.
But the possibility of being publicly embarrassed
Yes.
is deeply powerful.
What I don't get, and maybe you can explain it simply, because I think it's a question a lot of people feel, is why is there such variance in experience at the front as a patient in the NHS? You go to one GP, they work this way. You go to another GP down the road, they work that way.
Yeah.
There's no homogenization of positive experience. And you compare it to, it's a bit crass to say it, but if you imagined every Waitrose manager or Sainsbury's manager had carte blanche to run his supermarket like he does, then there'd be you wouldn't know where the hell you were. And I think that's how people feel in the NHS. They don't know how things are meant to work because there's no standard. It's all up to various individuals to say this is how we're going to do it. Why is that?
In a sense, you're looking at it's kind of one of the fundamental issues of how do you balance what should be national and what should be local?
Yeah.
And how do you do quality? And actually, the truth is, Darcy's original report in 2008 for the Gordon Brown government, because Lord Darcy was originally brought in. He was a minister.
He was a minister.
He was a health minister
of all the talents,
in the government of all the talents for Labour. So his peerage, he chose to become a crossbench peer after he stood down as health minister. But he was a Labour minister, and he was very much into bringing the principles of quality in. And his report, of course, landed in 2008, as did the global financial crisis, and therefore, unfortunately, fell on slightly stony ground, where the NHS was already thinking, we're going to have to retrench, not quite knowing that it was going to face a decade of retrenching. And, some of this is about the NHS does not automatically have a tendency to be candid. It's a really bizarre thing when you think about it, because it's a safety critical industry, and if we look at other safety critical industries, you can never draw exact analogies. So you can learn some things from the aviation industry, you can learn some things from the nuclear industry. They're also massively different. So, for example, pilots are very, very keen on aviation safety because they don't want to die if the plane hasn't been maintained properly. The nuclear industry, I think, has a particularly strong record of encouraging people to report problems. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's like an engineering mindset.
Yes.
And actually, that is not widely present, I would say, widely consistent across the NHS. There are pockets of really great practice, but candour's really hard. Change is hard anyway, but change with more candour, I think, is really hard. So, a small example, a mate of mine, a guy called Joe Rafferty, and he's just retired from running the mental health trust in Liverpool, Mersey Care, and they decided that they wanted to really go for zero suicides as being that was going to be a big project of theirs. Now, they started that more than a decade ago.
Yeah.
And it was really hard, and super, super hard, and tough for the staff to deal with. Obviously, they didn't succeed just because they'd announced it. So, but it made them really look at almost everything that they did. And they made vast improvements. The bit that I think is sensible in what we have heard, and we have heard very little about what their concrete plans are, and I'm afraid I'm probably not articulating with any brilliant clarity what a reform agenda would absolutely look like. But there are certain things where we could change the incentive quite quickly. Looking at clinical negligence and how we resolve that would be top of the list for me, because Darcy touches on that in the report. The figures are staggering. We're spending billions on responding to clinical negligence. because at the moment we tend to respond in a legalised adversarial way of going to court. Prove that we did it, prove that we harmed your relative, rather than looking at things and saying that was a terrible thing. On the balance of probability, we were maybe 60% responsible for it, or we were 30% responsible for it. Because, I think a lot of the time, maybe people don't want the money as much as they want change.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure that's true.
And when you read all the media reports, whatever, and, something goes badly wrong somewhere in NHS care, and it's go, lessons will be learned.
Yes.
Lessons have been
All the
learned.
time.
And it's kind of like, really?
Will they?
Really? So bringing some actual, concrete accountability. At the moment, we have a lot of accountability, and Darcy touches on this in his comments about management in his report, and kind of the vast increases in staffing of NHS England and the Department for Health and the regulators, and we've sort of got this. A few years ago, I described it as a constellation of regulatory Death Stars, but I think the point. You look at them now, and you look at the state of the NHS. They're actually a constellation of shit regulatory Death Stars.
Yeah.
That it would be fine to have that level of staffing and resource in those organisations if it did something.
Yeah.
But it doesn't.